Greetings, everyone. It's Alaya Ketani, and this is my new podcast, We Are Our Superhero. I've created this podcast to be real, sometimes raw, and to illustrate and bring to you real stories from myself and my guests who have had to expand beyond societal programming, personal held limits in order to navigate life, to come through difficult experiences, and sometimes to save our own lives. Today is our introductory episode, and my friend Mark is going to be having a conversation with me in order for you to learn some things about why I am creating this podcast and two other offerings as well right now. And us to have a conversation about life and other things. I'm noticing that my screen is flickering. So let's hope that that changes it. If you are interested in being a guest on my podcast, please email alchemizechange@gmail.com. There'll be other links below this if you're interested in the program that I've created in accompaniment with this podcast for women. That landing page is alchemizechange.com, Our Superhero. That's a slash, Our Superhero. My nonprofit, keepingallwomensafe.com. Many people know me as the founding director of Keeping All Women Safe, especially in Southern Oregon. A lot of other people know me as a hypnotherapist and change agent, first with empowering hypnotherapy in many different states and Europe, and also Alchemize Change, which has been the name of my practice for the last few years. Other people knew me as one of the most active mediators for a period of years, and before that, a social worker for different agencies. So hopefully you will come to know me better through this podcast, and may what you hear provide hope for you and inspiration when you need it most. May it expand your mind and fill your heart with all the encouragement and wisdom that you've been seeking by watching these episodes. So, Mark, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it very much. Mark's in another state, and he's offering his time to visit with me today.
So, Alea, we know each other from Ashland, Oregon years ago, but I really don't know really much about you. And so I'm just going to ask you some questions so that not only I can get to know you, but of course your audience can. And I'd like to really get in there and know like what has you ticking? Why do you do what you do? Like what drives the passion behind what you do and what do you do?
Good question. So, first of all, I have felt strongly about the power that women hold when unified since I was a little girl. I used to feel like all the girls should get organized, even in elementary school. We should have little meetings on the playground. And I was very loyal friend. Like if someone was mean to my friend, I was not going to be friends with that person. And I found that most women or girls weren't that way, that there was a lot of divisiveness. There was not power because there was no unity. And yet throughout all the years in my life, I continued to do my best to bring women together in different ways. So the nonprofit Keeping All Women Safe was formed for two reasons. Because of certain circumstances, which I'm going to talk about after I share my inspiration for the nonprofit, I grew up feeling the responsibility of two things. Number one, to keep my mother safe from my father. They were at war. It was a terrifying household. I would run to get in between them, and therefore then I would take the heat. Secondly, My other responsibility to my mother was to help keep her safe from her own mind, which had a program that told her that she was going to die at 52 from a certain disease because her mother had died at 52 of a certain disease. So she was very dependent on me, and I did my best to fulfill both of those responsibilities. I left for college. She got her diagnosis. She did die at 52 of that disease. Watching my mother and my father at war, I made a commitment to myself that I would never put myself in that position.
Mm.
However, shortly after I returned to college, after leaving for a quarter to help the family while my mother was in her dying process, I had a little baby brother, um, and a very difficult father. Shortly after I returned to college, I met a man who was a magnified version of what my parents had experienced. And I was very vulnerable and ensnared by this person who intentionally sought to destroy me for a period of time. So both my mother and myself, recognizing the power of that programming, the power of ancestral trauma, the power of our subconscious mind that records and tracks everything and is the source of 95% of our thoughts and behaviors. Those were inspirations for my nonprofit as well as my private practice because of what was going on in my household as a little girl. And because I just came into this life as a deep little girl, I realized I needed to find out why I was created. And I was even surprised I knew that word. Like, how do I know that word created? I'm just a little kid. However, I knew that what was going on in my house seemed cruel. And I knew a way that was pure and loving and kind. So I need to find out what this life was about. And I began seeking wisdom and understanding very young, reading about existentialism and the power of the mind and many different spiritual paths, hanging out with grown-ups. And um, so that was, in a way, the inspiration for my private practice working with clients, although it was more of a calling because as a young girl, I would stare at people and pull their pain into myself. My mother didn't realize I was doing that. She was from Boston and very um, proper in certain ways. And so she would reprimand me for staring. But I realized that I was pulling out their pain, and it turned into um, a situation where, as the years would go by and I became a young adult, people started following me in grocery stores to tell me they're suffering, and waitresses crying at my table and airports. And um, so it was a calling that I tried to run from in my 20s with several other careers. Um, but upon coming to Oregon, I became a social worker and dove straight into that calling.
It's so interesting that many people who end up in these type of wellness professions, so to speak, they are just born right out of, you know, the ethers with this innate desire and an innate knowing that automatically and very naturally seems like you start just playing this part at a very early age. And I would imagine at a very early age, you got into some people's business by just being innocent and wanting to support and help. But I imagine you also received some kind of pushback when you were a child for that, yeah?
Well, I received pushback because um, I was gifted in certain ways. So very young, I I began having what I call feeling visions. So it was the sight, the sound, the message, and the feel all in one. And through that, I knew when people weren't telling the truth. And I didn't know that people would get very upset when they were lying to me. And I would say to them, I know you think that you're fooling me, but actually, I know you're lying. And people would get very angry. You can imagine people would get very angry. And actually, into my early adulthood, I was still letting people know that I knew they were lying, and they were getting more and more in my face until one day, um, a woman I was rooming with in the Silicon Valley, I had a secret government clearance at that time, and I was contracting in government defense in Silicon Valley. And I shared something with her. She wasn't well, and I could see why. And I shared it with her, and she got right in my face and she said, advice that is not asked for is not appreciated. And that was the end of it. I realized that is really true, and it's really uncomfortable when people get in my face and they're super hostile. And so not only did I realize that what I was feeling and knowing about people was none of my business unless they asked, but I also realized that I needed to start developing a better sense around myself. I didn't know the word boundaries yet, but I knew that I needed somehow to develop some sense of not having people coming to me with everything. Because it was, you can imagine, it was a burden to be a child, but having to play the parent to my mother, even though we were very, very close. Um, when she passed on, I felt a double feeling. I felt sadness and grief and loss, but I also felt relief.
Relief. Of course you
Um,
did.
yeah,
Absolutely. I get it. So
yeah.
you
And
had a,
so, being a very sensitive, a highly sensitive person, one experiences beauty and depth and meaningful connection ever so much more, but we also experience much more deep processing than the typical person, um, potentially a stronger reaction to things that we have to learn how to discipline. Um, most of my life, people have said to me, oh, it's easy for you to be calm, Alaya. Oh, we just love being around you because you're so calm, Alaya. Your voice is so calm, Alaya. But they don't realize that all of the skills that I teach, everything that I bring to my clients is because I need it. I've had to learn it for my own self, for my own preservation, and even more going to my new offerings to actually continue living, to come through extreme crisis and to keep living. Um, so, yeah, I would say that I was born with a calling. In my 20s, I tried many different professions. I was trained as a stockbroker, a real estate broker. I worked for the third largest ad agency in the world. This was in LA. I was a national field operations director for a Hollywood-based market research firm. That's when I realized I loved to travel. Um, and I had a secret government clearance all in my 20s. And then at 29, I sold everything and got a van and just took off to travel the backroads because LA had become a hassle. And I realized that I was going to give it up before it gave me up. I had watched what happened to attractive women in LA when they were no longer young, and no longer young meant like after they were 25, right? And the suffering that those women uh, was experiencing. And so there were a number of reasons I took off on that trip. It's very, very naive still, but wielding a certain power, noticing the effect of that power, but not being a savvy, tricky woman and not really using it for any type of advantage. Just curious, mostly curious. Yeah. And then when I became a social worker, it was when this van trip brought me to Oregon, and it was really the best job in the town, it just, it would the glove fit, right? The glove fit. So I worked for agencies for 30 years, and about 25 of that, I worked nights and weekends in my private practice as a hypnotherapist and a lot more. And then about 15 years ago, I stopped with the agencies and only worked in my private practice. And then about 7 years ago, founded the nonprofit also.
Well, it sounds like you've experienced the whole gamut of like a Western culture, like the corporate thing, the government thing, the having to face, so much as your childhood, being an aware young woman, being an attractive young woman, seeing the nonsense that happens in this culture. And it sounds like, from what I'm hearing from you, you just finally got so hip to it, you just had to leave. It wasn't going to take you down a road that you wanted to. You took off and traveled the back roads. You say the back roads. Can you speak a little bit more about that chapter of your life where you just, what awareness did you have, your final awareness that had you say, I'm not doing this thing anymore, and I'm going to shift gears and go into the back roads and live like that? What did you experience there and learn from that place?
Yeah, so it really, there was an awareness that everything had become a hassle. So there was when I first went to UCLA, it was thrilling. It was exciting. I'd grown up in a little surfing capital. My parents had been very controlling. And suddenly I was dropped off in LA. And so in my naivete, I was all over that city. I say I majored in city life. That continued to an extent after I graduated college. A couple years later, I moved to the beach, Playa del Rey. But the traffic and the whole scene became a hassle for me. It no longer held the curiosity. I'd experienced a lot. Um, the idea of getting a van and traveling the back roads wasn't solely mine. I don't know whose idea it was to do it that way. As I said in that field operations gig, I learned that I love to travel. So I knew I wanted to take off. And somewhere that idea came. So first I got a Volkswagen bus and soon realized it was too small to live in. So I traded it out for this big Dodge Ram with side pipes, but it wasn't converted. There's a big resurgence of that now with women, and they're spending like $100,000 to equip these fancy vans. I had a foam mat, a one burner stove to cook my spaghetti. I put curtains up so I could smoke pot back there. And I had one tub that when I put a trash bag in, it was my potty. And when the trash bag was out and it was clean, it was my kitchen sink. It was very simple. There were no cell phones, right? There was no technology. And I didn't even know how to make a campfire. I didn't even know I needed to know. This was the interesting thing to me now. It's, I was so innocent even though I had experienced so much. And I actually had a uncle who used to come into town a couple times a year. He'd stay at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he had a big multi-million-dollar corporation, and he'd have dinner with these wealthy old men, and he would invite me to dinner, like fixing me up with these men. Um, and he would say to me, "Oh, Alaya, keep that innocence. It's so attractive." And even back then, I would wonder, how am I supposed to keep my innocence when you're fixing me up with these old iggy men just because they have a bunch of money? And I'm seeing I was everywhere. I was in houses that I didn't know the people. I walked into orgies. I was at all kinds of parties. I was in the celebrity world. I was dating a Super Bowl star and a movie producer. And I was exposed to a lot, but somehow I was still able to preserve my innocence. So when I took off in that van, it was that, beach girl that was just happiest in that simple flip-flop state of mind. And um, actually, I had just won the largest federal discrimination suit in California history at the time. And so that gave me the bankroll to buy the van and to go wherever for at least a year or two or more.
Mm.
Um, so all those things coming together caused me to take off. Yeah.
So two questions. One is, what did you learn about yourself and life when you were out there in the back roads? And then what caused you to want to shift gears again to come back into your next chapter beyond that?
So what I learned on that trip, first of all, it was very confidence building.
Mm.
There were times when certainly I felt fear. I was in the middle of nowhere. I was in the middle of the tail end of a typhoon in a redwood forest. I had a mountain lion on the roof of my van in the Sierras. Occasionally, I met someone who I could feel had bad energy, and I had to give them this glare that I call the don't F with me glare.
Yeah.
Um, I learned that I'm happiest in nature, by a campfire, in the simple life. Whenever I was around people in a campground, everyone came to my campfire and told me their life story. People from all over the world came to my campfire and told me their life stories. So I had amazing experiences through them. Lots of stories I could tell about that. One couple from the Netherlands who we took pictures and they didn't show up when the film was produced. Every other picture did, but not them. I can tell that story. But so I learned those things about myself. And coming to Oregon, I was split. There was a part of me that had heard that Swami Satchidananda, who I was following for a while, learning through, was building this Lotus Center in, I think it was Pennsylvania. And a part of me was ready to take off for that versus an ex-partner who caught up with me and um, essentially talked me into this plan that he had that we would buy acreage in Oregon and develop it and relocate there. It was really his plan. And it was the same person who I had become ensnared by when I had returned to college after my mother's passing. Um, this was a pattern where I would take off and he would find me. Um, so it was a combination of things that caused me to then, that was when I returned to the Silicon Valley to make some more money. And then I returned and bought the acreage on the coast and developed that. Lived on that for about 15 years, maybe.
Mhm.
And then came to the Rogue Valley with an escape plan from that same person who had really become a very dangerous psychopathic person. And there was no one to help me at that point. It was very, very dire circumstances. And so I created my own escape plan. And thankfully, it was successful. It took a period of months to complete and 2 emergency surgeries, but I came over the mountain, and um, that was about 25 years ago. And here I am. Although I have left. Here also, my screen is flickering again. trying to change the position of it here. So yeah, many different parts of my life. I've lived what I call a very concentrated life. Sometimes I refer to it as overly eventful. I've experienced many things. I've come through situations, crisis, catastrophes where I was told there was no hope. And that's why I consider myself the messenger of hope. There is always hope. There is always a way. And I can identify many different essential components to coming through not only daily life, but crisis as well, which is the basis of this podcast and my new program, which is Superhero Woman
Yeah, what
Hypnotherapy and
about that?
Mentoring Program.
What is Superhuman Woman, please? And
Yes,
what
superhero.
motivated you to launch this
Yeah.
program? What is it, and what's the motivation behind it?
So, because I've lived such an unconventional life, I've never really allowed society to tell me how I should act or look or where I should be in terms of societal expectations in my life. Um, and as the years have gone by, and I've been even surprised myself that I have made it through some of these nearly non recoverable situations, um, it became clear to me, um, not when I turned 70, when I turned 71. And I know some people are surprised to hear that um, I've lived that many years. Um, but it became clear to me when I turned the age of 71 that now is the time to offer the knowledge, the skills, the practices that came through a lifetime of training, over 40 years experience with clients, many unusual experiences in life, and the unique insights that can only come from very dire circumstances and harnessing the qualities, characteristics that it takes and that it took for me to come through, not just once, but 5 different times at least. And so, I started typing up a list. I have a big piece of paper with a lot of lists, and I realized I know everybody's doing podcasts. I had a very popular radio show a few years back called Empower Your Life. A lot of people still comment about it to me when they see me out. So I thought, well, now is the time for podcasts. I'll just create a podcast and have different guests that talk about how they had to be their own superhero. Now, some of those episodes, people will notice I started off saying hero, not superhero. This podcast was called We Are Our Hero. And I've introduced those episodes that way. But at one point, I realized actually those are two different meanings. We
Mm.
can have a hero, someone we admire, someone who did something, defied fear. But a superhero is someone who we think have these supernatural powers that the common individual does not, when actually the truth of who and what we truly are, essentially are, has unlimited possibilities, has unlimited potential, has powers. We've just been programmed to believe, well, I'm just human, right? I'm
Right.
just a mere human.
Right. So there was a time, and most of us are in that category of being so conditioned and flattened, and those qualities we have inside so numbed out or not so accessible. What did you do that you finally broke through that nonsense to just to know and realize what you just said is something that's real, that you can cultivate, and you can even go from there and enhance even more? How did you and where and when did you discover that?
Why don't we start part two right here? We'll close this one out because that enters a whole other branch of information. that I'd be happy to share. And so for the people who are listening, stay tuned for part 2. I'm happy you're joining us. I'm happy you're joining this podcast. If you're interested in learning more, you can subscribe. And the links will be below. And we'll see you in part 2. Thank you, Mark.